A solitary streetlight flickered in the pre-dawn gloom of a Chicago alley, where worn brick walls and battered dumpsters bore silent witness to the harsh reality of the city's underbelly. The wind whipped through the narrow passage, carrying the faint smell of stale pizza crusts and last night's uncollected trash. On this frigid winter morning, most of the world lay curled in warm beds, oblivious to the small dramas playing out in the unseen corners of the metropolis. But there was one witness, a creature as weathered by time and circumstance as the alley itself. A stray dog with matted fur, ribs poking through its patchy coat, and eyes that gleamed with quiet intelligence. That dog, nicknamed Rusty by a handful of kind passers-by who would occasionally toss him scraps, had been roaming these streets for months. He was a survivor, an urban wanderer who spent his nights scrounging for food and avoiding the city's many dangers. Cars speeding over slushy streets, late-night revelers hurling insults, and the looming threat of animal control. Rusty had once been someone's beloved pet, also a compassionate local guest from his willingness to approach humans. But time had taught him caution, and so he kept to the shadows, operating on a delicate balance between trust and fear. On that particular morning, Rusty was on one of his usual routes, sniffing at the base of a dumpster for anything edible. He had no grand illusions of finding a feast, yet hunger propelled him to check every corner. The city's biting cold seeped through his brittle pores, and a thin layer of ice clung to his whiskers. Clouds of steam accompanied every exhale he took. Just as he was about to turn away in disappointment, his ears perked up. He heard a sound so out of place in that lonely alleyway that it stopped him in his tracks, a soft, whimpering cry. Ears straining, Rusty looked around. At first, he saw nothing but the contorted shapes of dumpster lids and discarded cardboard boxes. Then, through the darkness, he caught a faint glimmer of movement next to a stack of broken pallets. Carefully, he treaded toward the shape, his paw pad slick against the iced-over pavement. As he drew closer, the plaintive noise intensified, pinging off the walls in ever-so-gentle echoes that made Rusty whine in turn. It was not the cry of a cat or another dog. It was distinctly human. Sniffing the air, Rusty followed the scent of something both new and strangely comforting, milk, a faint fragrance of powder, and something else that spurred his protective instincts. When he finally reached the pallets, he saw a small, blanketed form on the ground. Inside that blanket, which was damp and freezing, lay a tiny baby. The child's cheeks were reddened by the cold, and its weak cries seemed to fade in and out, as though it was already exhausted by its own desperation. Rusty stood frozen for a moment, stunned by the sight. He'd rummaged through piles of refuse countless times, but never had he encountered a baby in such perilous circumstance. A primal urge awakened within him, a flicker of paternal or maternal instinct that had no logic, only compassion. He nudged the blanket with his nose, trying to warm the child's skin with whatever body heat he could offer. As the frigid wind whipped down the alley, Rusty circled the baby, pressing his side against the child to block the gusts. Though his own coat was ragged, he instinctively tried to act as a windbreak. The baby's crying subsided slightly, perhaps soothed by the presence of another living creature. But Rusty knew the situation was dire. The biting cold of a Chicago winter could be fatal, especially for a baby with little more than a thin blanket for protection. He needed help that only humans could provide. In an almost otherworldly moment of clarity, Rusty remembered that he sometimes saw people near the back of a nearby diner around sunrise. The smell of frying bacon and burnt coffee always wafted out from that place. A kind-hearted short-order cook named Marisol had more than once given Rusty scraps of leftover bacon or an overcooked biscuit. If he could get her attention, maybe she would do something. The question was how to alert her. He was just a dog, after all. Yet there was no choice. He had to try. With one last glance at the helpless infant, Rusty made a decision. He licked the baby's cheek as if to offer comfort, then trotted off in the direction of the diner, his nails scraping the ice-slick pavement. The wind battered him, but the urgency of the situation pushed him forward. He had to move quickly. Every minute wasted put the baby in greater danger. After navigating a series of alleys and side streets, Rusty emerged onto a slightly busier thoroughfare where the diner stood in a row of old shops. The neon sign above the entrance flickered, and the windows were foggy with condensation from the warmth inside. Rusty peered through the glass door, spotting Marisol wiping down the counter. The bustle of the city was just beginning. A few taxicabs rumbled past, their tires crunching against the slush. He approached the back entrance of the diner, hoping Marisol might be there. On most mornings, she took the trash out around this time. With an expectant whine, Rusty paced back and forth, occasionally standing on his hind legs to peer over the dumpster. But no one emerged. The seconds ticked by in agonizing slowness. The baby's face flashed through his mind, red and crying, alone in the cold. Just when Rusty began to panic, the door swung open. Out stepped Marisol, a stout woman in her early 50s with dark curly hair pulled into a net, wearing a grease-stained apron. She carried a garbage bag in one hand, a tired expression on her face. As she lowered the bag into the dumpster, Rusty backed, a sharp, insistent sound that echoed through the quiet back lot. Marisol jumped at the unexpected noise. She recognized Rusty immediately. "Hey there, boy," she said, her voice carrying both warmth and caution. "Are you hungry again?" She glanced around for leftover scraps. But Rusty barked once more, his tail wagging in anxious circles. He trotted away a few steps, then looked back at her, barking again. Confused, Marisol took a hesitant step forward. "What is it? Something wrong?" she murmured, setting the garbage bag down and wiping her hands on her apron. Rusty repeated the gesture, trotting ahead and then turning his head as if beckoning her to follow. There was something about his demeanor, urgency in his eyes, a whine that shook his whole body, that stirred Marisol's sense of alarm. She had lived in this neighborhood for many years and had occasionally encountered strays, but never one that seemed so desperate for her to follow. All right, Marisol said softly, pulling the door closed behind her and making sure it latched. The warmth of the diner disappeared as she stepped into the cold alley. "Show me, boy," Rusty, relieved, led her through the maze of side streets. Marisol shivered in the morning chill, breath puffing in short bursts. Each corner they rounded brought them deeper into the labyrinth of the city's forgotten arteries, away from the glow of streetlights. She nearly lost sight of him when he darted around a particularly tight bend, but his barks kept her on track. At last, they arrived back in the narrow alley that Rusty called home. The stacked pallets came into view, faintly illuminated by the flickering street lamp. Marisol's eyes widened as she noticed a small lump of cloth on the ground. Her heart hammered in her chest, an uneasy dread settling in her stomach. When she finally saw the baby, her hands flew to her mouth. The baby was barely moving, its cries weak and feeble. Kneeling quickly, Marisol gingerly picked up the infant, unwrapping the damp blanket to check for injuries. She was no medical professional, but she could see the baby was freezing, its tiny lips tinged blue. Her own eyes welled with tears at the helplessness of this fragile life. "How? Who?" she stammered, unable to piece together a coherent sentence. She glanced at Rusty, who stood vigil by her side, tail wagging slightly, as if asking, "Is the baby safe now?" Overcome by the shock of the moment, Marisol fumbled in her coat pocket for her cell phone. Her first call was to 911, voice trembling as she alerted the dispatcher of the emergency, an abandoned baby in desperate need of warmth and care. The dispatcher assured her that help was on the way and advised her to keep the baby warm. "I will," Marisol whispered, tears threatening to spill over. She removed her coat and wrapped it around the small form, holding the child close to her chest to share body heat. As sirens pierced the early morning quiet, Rusty took a few steps back. The approaching lights and wailing sounds made him uneasy. Every instinct told him to run, to hide in the shadows that had become his only sanctuary. Yet he stayed. Something about that baby felt more important than his own fear of humans. He watched from a short distance, his body tense, as a police cruiser and an ambulance rolled up to the entrance of the alley. 2 paramedics hurried over with a gurney, carefully taking the baby from Marisol's arms. A police officer approached, scanning the alley for any sign of who might have left the child there. Marisol tried to explain everything that happened, pointing at Rusty, but the officer shook his head, perplexed by the notion that a stray dog had led her here. Despite the chaos of the moment, Marisol couldn't help but look at Rusty with wonder. This dog, homeless and half-starved, had saved a child's life. As the baby was placed into the ambulance, a wave of relief washed over her. She bowed her head, silently praying for the infant's survival. Rusty remained at a distance, watching as red and blue light swirled across the walls. His old life had taught him to be wary, but his heart told him to stay just a little longer, to make sure the baby was truly safe. By the time the paramedics climbed into the ambulance and the doors slammed shut, Rusty was trembling, partly from cold, partly from adrenaline. Then, just as the ambulance pulled away, Marisol remembered Rusty. She called out, her voice breaking, "Doggy, wait!" But Rusty, overwhelmed by the sudden attention and noise, darted around the corner and disappeared into the gray morning light. Marisol stood there, coatless and shivering, still trying to process the surreal events of the last few minutes. The memory of that little baby's face, and the dog who had found them, etched itself permanently into her mind. The sun had yet to fully rise. The city of Chicago was already alive with the usual bustle, delivery trucks, early shift workers, and the slow, steady beat of traffic. But in that hidden alley, something extraordinary had happened. A stray dog had discovered an abandoned infant, and in doing so, had planted the seeds of a story that would touch hearts far beyond this lonely stretch of pavement. Marisol didn't know it then, but this was only the beginning. In the hours to come, the baby's rescue would set off a chain of events that would reveal heartbreak, hope, and the resilience of the human and canine spirit. And at the heart of it all stood Rusty, the stray dog who, by following his instincts, unwittingly became a hero. In the hours following the baby's discovery, the emergency room of Chicago General Hospital buzzed with urgency. Nurses and doctors rushed the infant into a warm, sterile room, hooking up monitors to check for signs of hypothermia or other complications. The child, a tiny girl with a tuft of dark hair, lay still except for faint movements of her hands. Her cry had weakened to a soft mewing, as though the ordeal had depleted her energy completely. A pediatrician on call, Dr. Eleanor Brooks, carefully examined her vitals, trying to remain calm despite the weight of the situation. Back at the precinct, Officer Juan Salazar and Officer Brenda Michaels took down Marisol's account. She recounted every detail, how she found the dog, how it led her to the baby, and the exact state of the infant when she arrived. Each time she mentioned Rusty, her eyes filled with gratitude. Officer Michaels leaned forward, clearly moved by the notion of a stray dog performing such a heroic act. "It sounds like something out of a movie," she mused, scribbling notes on a pad. Officer Salazar nodded, adding that it wasn't every day they encountered a stray saving a child's life. Marisol, who had finally composed herself after the adrenaline rush, was allowed to leave the station. She had given her statement and contact information in case more questions arose. But before heading home, she did something out of character. She asked the officers if they had any news on the dog. "We have animal control keeping an eye out," they assured her, "but they are spread thin." Marisol felt a pang of concern. Rusty had become an unexpected hero, and she worried about him facing the perils of the city alone. Meanwhile, in a cramped apartment on the south side, an unkempt young man named Donnell tossed and turned on his mattress. Across the room sat a beaten-up radio, softly playing local news. Donnell had no idea that a baby girl had been found in an alley or that a stray dog was involved. All he knew was that his life was in shambles. He'd lost his job and was behind on rent. As the news story began to unfold on the radio, he half-listened, eyes heavy with exhaustion. The reporter's voice spoke of a baby discovered behind a stack of pallets, a dog leading a concerned citizen to the rescue, and the infant's uncertain future. Donnell turned the volume up, something about the story piercing his mental fog. He felt a twist of emotion, but he couldn't place it. Shaking his head, he tried to fall back asleep. At that moment, across town, Dr. Brooks finished her initial examination of the baby. She breathed a sigh of relief. Though the infant was dangerously cold, there were no immediate signs of permanent damage. A nurse covered the baby with a thermal blanket, checking her temperature every few minutes. "We'll need to keep her for observation," Dr. Brooks said, making notes on a patient chart. The child was listed as Jane Doe for now. Over the next few hours, word of the remarkable rescue spread through the hospital corridors. Attendants, orderlies, and fellow doctors would pop into the pediatric unit to see how the belly baby was doing. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the stray dog that found her. Some staffers joked that the dog deserved a medal, while others wondered who on earth could abandon such a tiny infant in a Chicago winter. Dr. Brooks couldn't help feeling a mix of anger and sadness. She had seen many tragic cases in her career, but something about this situation, that it was a dog, of all creatures, who led a human to save the baby, struck her as profoundly moving. Meanwhile, Rusty wandered the streets, unaware of the hospital drama. After he fled from the sirens, he found refuge under a rusted fire escape in a nearby neighborhood. Curled up against the cold metal, he tried to rest, but images of the baby kept flashing in his mind. If a dog can be said to have such memories, his instincts told him to return to that alley, to ensure the infant was truly safe. But the chaotic lights and sounds that accompanied the rescue still frightened him. So he roamed in search of food, occasionally stopping by spots he knew might yield a dropped hot dog or half-eaten sandwich. Yet something had changed within him. He felt a pull toward the place and the people involved in the rescue. By mid-morning, Marisol returned to the diner. She could barely focus on her job, mind swirling with questions about the child's fate. Customers came and went, many of them discussing the news. Some speculated that the baby's mother was young and desperate. Others voiced outrage at the cruelty of leaving a newborn in such conditions. Every time Marisol heard the words, "stray dog," her heart clenched. She kept glancing out the diner window, hoping Rusty would appear. She had wrapped up some sausages in a napkin, just in case. Her chance came near noon. A co-worker stepped outside to take out the trash and hurried back in, exclaiming, "He's here. That dog is out back." Marisol practically sprinted into the alley. There he was, hunched against the diner wall, sniffing the pavement. At the sight of Marisol, Rusty's tail wagged in slow, hesitant circles, as though he recognized a friend. "Hey there, hero," she said gently. Rusty approached with caution, muzzle low but eyes bright. Marisol offered him the sausages, and he devoured them in seconds. She crouched down, speaking in soft tones. "Thank you for what you did. The baby's safe now, okay? You did a good thing." She wasn't sure if Rusty could understand her words, but he seemed to sense her gratitude and kindness. When she reached out to pat his head, he allowed it, closing his eyes briefly as though savoring the human touch he'd been missing for so long. In that brief interlude, Marisol felt an overwhelming warmth flood her chest. Before all this, she'd never given much thought to adopting a pet or even fostering one. She was busy, living paycheck to paycheck, caring for an elderly mother at home. But something about Rusty's gentle spirit made her heart ache. She wished she could give him a home right there and then. But she wasn't sure if she had the means or if her mother's fragile health could handle a dog. Reluctantly, she told herself that she'd at least keep feeding him and earn his trust until she figured out a better plan. Around the same time, the Chicago Child Protective Services, CPS, became involved, notifying social workers about the baby. One of those social workers, Laura Caldwell, was assigned the case. As soon as she read the preliminary report, she hurried to the hospital. Laura was a calm, no-nonsense woman who prided herself on her ability to remain level-headed. But even she felt a pang of emotion when she laid eyes on the tiny infant in the pediatric ward. Dr. Brooks briefed her on the situation, explaining the initial tests and the baby's slow but steady progress toward recovery. Laura and Dr. Brooks discussed next steps. The baby, who still had no official name, would likely be placed in temporary foster care unless the mother or father came forward. The hospital and CPS were required to alert the authorities and local organizations, so if anyone knew anything, they could help locate the parents or relatives. Laura looked at the baby's small face, noticing the slight flutter of her eyelids. She felt a sudden urge to protect this little life, vowing to do whatever it took to find her a loving home. Whether that meant reuniting her with a responsible parent or finding an adoptive family. As the day wore on, stories of the baby and the stray dog began circulating on social media. Someone had snapped a photo of the alley, though Rusty himself was barely visible in the background, and posted it online with a dramatic caption about a guardian angel dog. Local news stations picked it up, featuring interviews with bystanders who had seen the commotion and were eager to fill in details, accurate or otherwise. While some dismissed it as a sensational story, others felt a surge of hope. In a city often plagued by grim headlines, here was a moment of pure compassion. By dusk, Officer Salazar found himself finishing the last of his paperwork on the case. He was deeply moved by the entire situation. A father of two, he couldn't help imagining his own children. How could anyone abandon a baby in an alley? The questions were endless, and the answers scarce. He resolved to follow up on any leads, no matter how trivial. He also wanted to do something for the dog, though departmental resources were limited. Perhaps he could nudge a local rescue group to step in. The dog had done a service that no one else could. It seemed only right to ensure its safety in return. Beyond the sterile halls of the hospital and the fluorescent-lit precinct, in the quiet corners of the city, the emotional ripple effects of this event were just beginning. People whispered about the baby's miraculous survival and the dog's heroics. Some prayed for the mother, that she might find help. Others debated whether justice should be harsh or forgiving. But one thing remained consistent in every version of the story: the raw humanity and caninity at its core. While the baby slept under the watchful care of Dr. Brooks, and Marisol cleaned the diner's counters for the closing shift, Rusty found a patch of dry cardboard behind a warehouse to settle down for the night. He nosed the ground, scratching at a soggy piece of newspaper, and curled up to sleep. He did not understand the sensation of being lauded as a hero or the intricacies of child protective procedures. All he knew was that he had heard a cry in the alley and answered it, and in doing so, he had unwittingly changed not just the baby's fate, but the course of many lives in the days yet to come. The next morning brought with it a raw, biting wind that rattled windows and scattered debris across the streets. Salt trucks rumbled through the main roads, leaving a gritty residue that crunched underfoot. Although the city was used to harsh winters, this particular cold snap felt personal, as if the wind were determined to probe every crack and corner, leaving no one untouched. Against this frigid backdrop, the story of the abandoned baby and the heroic stray dog continued to spread, capturing the hearts of residents who found a glimmer of hope in what otherwise seemed like a bleak season. Inside Chicago General Hospital, Dr. Brooks made her morning rounds to the pediatric unit. She checked on the baby, who was now out of immediate danger but still receiving care for mild hypothermia. Monitors beeped steadily, and the soft hum of a nearby incubator provided a soothing drone. The infant's color had improved, her cheeks flushed with a healthy pink rather than the alarming blue of the previous day. Dr. Brooks smiled as she lightly touched the baby's tiny hand. "Keep fighting," she whispered, then added in a more clinical tone to the nurse, "We'll monitor her vitals another 24 hours before we make any placement decisions." Meanwhile, Laura Caldwell, the CPS social worker, had a stack of paperwork taller than she liked to admit. She sifted through possible foster homes and read background checks. There were a few families who specialized in emergency placements for infants, but each had a waiting list or was already at capacity. Still, Laura remained optimistic. This baby's story had garnered attention, and more than one potential foster parent had reached out in the last 24 hours. She just had to confirm their suitability. Yet a nagging question loomed over her every thought. Where was the baby's biological mother? Would she come forward now that the story was on the news? Across town, Officer Salazar and Officer Michaels followed up on a scant lead. A convenience store clerk thought he'd seen a woman acting strangely near the alley where the baby was found. She had been wearing a dark coat and scarf, her face partially covered. The clerk wasn't sure of her age, but guessed late teens or early 20s. The woman had bought a small container of baby formula, which struck him as odd, given the hour. The officers jotted down the details, though it was hardly definitive. Still, they visited the store's security footage, hoping for a clearer image. Unfortunately, the camera angle was poor, and all they got was a blurry silhouette. Undeterred, they distributed flyers and asked nearby residents if they recognized the figure. So far, no one came forward with useful information. While the human side of the story grew more complicated, Rusty remained oblivious to the swirl of investigative efforts. He had survived another cold night and was beginning to feel the toll on his body. His coat, thin to begin with, did little to shield him from the plunging temperatures. Hunger gnawed at him constantly. Despite Marisol's kindness the day before, Rusty was not guaranteed regular meals. He resolved to return to the diner again, hopeful for a morsel of food and the warmth of gentle hands. But on his journey there, he encountered a threat, a city animal control officer, scanning the streets for strays. The battered white van rumbled along the icy road, its occupant peering from side to side, nets and cages at the ready. Rusty sensed the danger. He had seen that van before. He quickened his pace, turning down a smaller street in an attempt to evade capture. The vehicle followed, creeping forward with single-minded purpose. When Rusty tried to dart into an alley, he found a chain-link fence blocking his way. Trapped, he let out a frantic bark, doubling back on the sidewalk just as the officer leaped out of the van with a snare pole. A chase ensued. Rusty's nails scraped the concrete as he sprinted past astonished pedestrians. The officer gave chase, shouting for bystanders to move aside. At one point, Rusty nearly collided with a bicycle messenger. His heart pounded, and adrenaline coursed through him. If he were caught, he faced an uncertain fate at the city shelter, where strays often languished or were euthanized if they weren't claimed. Summoning every ounce of his street-savvy wits, Rusty ducked behind a delivery truck, zigzagging through parked cars, eventually losing the officer in the labyrinth of traffic. Chest heaving, he finally paused behind a dumpster to catch his breath. The echo of his pursuer's shouts faded, replaced by the dull roar of city life resuming its rhythm. In the wake of this narrow escape, Rusty abandoned his plan to head to the diner, at least for now. He sensed he needed to lie low. But where could he go? The city was a patchwork of potential hiding spots, yet each carried its own risks. Snow began to fall, tiny flakes that soon thickened into a veil of white. Rusty trudged onward, his paws leaving prints that quickly vanished in the accumulating powder. Meanwhile, Marisol noticed Rusty's absence with growing concern. During her lunch break, she stepped outside, scanning the alley for signs of him. She even walked a couple of blocks, calling softly, but there was no response. The city's hush of falling snow made her feel strangely isolated. She remembered the look in Rusty's eyes when he stood guard over the infant. Could it be that some official had taken him? The thought weighed heavily on her, and she resolved to ask her cousin, who worked part-time at a local rescue center, for advice on how to locate or protect a stray. She refused to believe that the dog's fate was to be picked up by animal control and forgotten. Back in her hospital room, the baby stirred, letting out a faint cry. A nurse arrived promptly, checking her diaper and making sure she was comfortable. A soft lullaby played from a mobile attached to the crib. Outside the glass partition, Dr. Brooks and Laura watched, relief evident on both their faces. "She's strong," Dr. Brooks commented, "and quite the fighter. I've seen worse cases. She'll pull through." Laura nodded. "I hope her mother comes forward. We can't finalize anything until we exhaust that possibility. But if not, at least she has a chance at a good life." Dr. Brooks exhaled, casting a wistful glance at the child. "Yes," she agreed quietly. "She certainly does." A beat passed. "Any news on the dog?" she asked, as if the two stories were inextricably linked. Laura shook her head. Not yet. Officer Salazar said he'd let me know if they found him. But as far as I know, he's still out there somewhere. The tension in her voice was impossible to miss. They both understood. Rusty was a hero in the eyes of many, yet the city had 1,000 corners for a stray to hide, and the winter was unkind. Without a proper home or consistent meals, a dog's survival was never guaranteed. The thought weighed on them, and they parted ways with a shared sense of worry. That afternoon, as the snowstorm intensified, the roads became slick and treacherous. Car horns blared, and frustrated drivers inched through blinding flurries. This was no weather for man nor beast. Huddled beneath an abandoned porch, Rusty curled into a tight ball, shivering as the wind howled. The day's events had taken a toll on him. Despite his instincts, he felt a longing to be with Marisol, where at least he could count on a friendly face and a warm morsel of food. Yet fear of the animal control van and the throng of potential dangers kept him pinned in place. Meanwhile, in a cramped apartment not far away, Donnell found himself unable to shake a peculiar sense of unease. He stared at a crumpled flyer taped to a community board in his hallway. "Have you seen this dog?" It featured a fuzzy screenshot from local news, presumably Rusty, though the image was grainy. A note underneath described the dog as a hero that saved a baby's life and asked anyone with information to contact a number. Donnell chewed the inside of his cheek, a storm of conflicting emotions brewing in his chest. He didn't know this dog, but something about the story, about stepping up, doing the right thing even when life had given you nothing, cut deep. He thought of his own struggles and failings, how he never seemed to rise above them. The more he read about the dog, the more Donnell felt a strange kinship. Against all odds, the stray had done something miraculous. Perhaps, Donnell mused, if a homeless dog could show compassion, maybe there was hope for a guy like him. A spark of determination flared inside him, however faint. Maybe he should do more than just read about this. Maybe he should try to help. He slipped the flyer off the board, folded it, and tucked it into his pocket. At the precinct, a sense of frustration mounted. Officer Salazar and Officer Michaels had followed up on a half-dozen dead-end leads about the baby's potential mother. No one claimed to know anything, and the blurry surveillance footage offered little. They had even posted on social media, urging people to come forward if they recognized the coat or the build of the mystery woman. So far, silence. The child's identity remained a mystery, and each day that passed reduced the likelihood of reuniting her with any biological family, assuming that was even a safe or good option. As evening descended, the city lights glowed against the swirling snow. Somewhere, Rusty wandered, dodging the watchful eyes of the animal control van. Somewhere, the baby slept, lulled by the steady beep of a heart monitor and the gentle hum of a hospital heater. And somewhere in the labyrinth of Chicago, an unknown mother carried the burden of a secret. Her decision to abandon her child in an alley, perhaps haunted by regret or fear. The tension coiled tighter with each passing hour. Everyone involved, Marisol, Dr. Brooks, Officer Salazar, Laura, even unsuspecting bystanders like Donnell, felt the gravity of the situation. Each had a part to play, whether or not they realized it yet. The stage was set for a convergence of destinies, a meeting point where compassion, desperation, and the spirit of a stray dog would intersect in a way none of them could have predicted. And in the stillness of a city that never truly sleeps, the whimper of a baby and the bark of a dog continued to echo, weaving together a story that demanded resolution, one that would test the boundaries of faith, love, and what it truly means to be saved. Days turned into a week, and the baby, still referred to as Jane Doe in official documents, grew stronger by the hour. Dr. Brooks noted each improvement with cautious optimism. Local news outlets picked up the story, dubbing the child Baby Hope, a moniker that quickly caught on among hospital staff. Hope seemed fitting for a baby rescued against all odds, and it was easier to say than Jane Doe. Nurses doted on her, and Laura Caldwell managed a stream of inquiries from potential foster families. Despite the heartbreak of her abandonment, Hope seemed destined for a new beginning. Yet a major piece of the puzzle remained unsolved: the baby's biological mother. The police had turned up no solid leads, leaving them in a frustrating stalemate. There was an undercurrent of urgency in the precinct, as officers worried that the mother might be a minor herself, alone, frightened, and possibly needing help. Officer Salasai and Officer Michaels redoubled their efforts, scanning social media for any hints or confessions, but the digital trail was cold. The convenience store clerk's tip still loomed in the background, but it led nowhere concrete. With time running out, they found themselves pinning faint hopes on a tip line that rarely bore fruit. On a brisk Monday morning, a breakthrough arrived from an unexpected source. The hospital receptionist called Laura Caldwell, mentioning that a young woman had stopped by earlier, asking about a newborn brought in after being found in an alley. The woman had been visibly upset and left abruptly when asked for identification. She provided no name, just an anxious inquiry if the baby was okay. Security footage from the hospital's lobby captured her face more clearly than the convenience store footage had. In the grainy black and white video, she appeared to be in her late teens or early 20s, wearing a knit cap and coat. She seemed hesitant, eyes scanning the area as though she feared being recognized. Laura rushed to show the footage to Officers Salasai and Michaels. They watched it multiple times, gleaning what they could. The woman seemed to have second thoughts about something. The next logical step was to trace her steps, check nearby bus or train stations, ask local businesses if they recognized her. The officers set out, armed with screenshots of the footage, knocking on doors in the vicinity. Though it felt like hunting for a needle in a haystack, this was the best lead they'd had in days. While they pounded pavement, Rusty's situation took a dangerous turn. The brutal cold snap had only worsened, with overnight temperatures plummeting. Marisol searched for him daily, carrying extra food in her jacket pocket. But the elusive dog was nowhere to be found. Animal control sightings had grown more frequent, turning the city's strays into prime targets for rounding up. On the 5th day of searching, Marisol decided she couldn't stand idly by. During her day off, she visited her cousin at the rescue center to see if Rusty had been picked up. The center was full to capacity, cages lined with anxious dogs whining for attention. A staff member scanned their logs but found no record of a dog matching Rusty's description. Frustrated but not defeated, Marisol borrowed an old coat from the rescue center and set out on foot. She wandered the alleys, calling Rusty's name, shining a flashlight into corners. The city was massive, her chances slim, but determination fueled her. She refused to let the hero dog vanish without a trace. After hours of fruitless searching, she finally discovered a small clue, a set of paw prints leading to an abandoned shipping yard. Hope sparked in her chest as she followed them, only for the trail to vanish where the snow had melted. Night was closing in, and a heavy sadness weighed on her as she realized she might not find him this way. Meanwhile, at the hospital, baby Hope was thriving. Dr. Brooks and the nurses took turns holding her, feeding her carefully measured formula. Even the pediatric interns got attached. The possibility that she would soon move to foster care lingered like a bittersweet farewell. One nurse joked that they should all adopt her collectively. That's how smitten they'd become. Then came the call that changed everything. Officer Michaels phoned Laura Caldwell, voice tinged with excitement. "We found her," she said, "the young woman from the hospital footage. She's at the precinct now." Laura wasted no time, rushing to the station. There, she found a trembling young woman in a tattered coat, hands shaking as she gripped a styrofoam cup of coffee. She introduced herself as Kylie. Through stifled sobs, Kylie admitted to being the baby's mother. Kylie's story was one of desperation. A turbulent home life, an abusive boyfriend who fled the moment he found out she was pregnant, and a mounting fear that she lacked the resources to care for a child. She had hidden her pregnancy from most everyone, eventually finding herself in labor in a cramped bathroom. Overcome by panic and postpartum confusion, she placed the infant in the alley, hoping someone, anyone, would find her before it was too late. That was all she could manage. Regret haunted her from the moment she walked away. She couldn't eat or sleep, and as soon as she saw the news about a baby's rescue, she knew it had to be her child. Officer Solisai and Officer Michaels looked on, their tough exteriors softened by Kylie's raw remorse. Laura Caldwell gently explained the severity of the situation. Abandoning a child carried serious legal implications, and CPS involvement was inevitable. Kylie nodded, tears staining her cheeks. She insisted she didn't want her baby to die. She thought leaving her in a well-traveled alley would ensure someone found her sooner. She had no idea a stray dog would be the one to intervene. The emotional weight in the interrogation room was palpable. Laura leaned forward and placed a hand on Kylie's shoulder. "We'll make sure your baby is safe," she said softly. "But we need to determine what's best. Are you willing to undergo counseling and an evaluation to see if you can care for her?" Kylie nodded, eyes brimming with hope and fear. The path ahead would be far from simple. Court hearings, parenting evaluations, therapy sessions, but at least now there was a possibility that mother and child could be reunited in a stable environment. The alternative was relinquishing her parental rights, but Laura sensed Kylie wanted to try, wanted to make amends. Word of Kylie's appearance spread quickly through the hospital staff, who were torn between relief and sorrow. Relief that the mother was found, sorrow for the circumstances that led her to such a desperate act. Dr. Brooks carried the news to the pediatric ward, where a few nurses wept openly. The story they'd been living, Baby Hope's miraculous survival, now had a new chapter. And it was complicated, to say the least. Late that evening, Laura guided Kylie through the hospital corridors to see her baby for the first time since the fateful night. They entered the softly lit room where Hope rested. Kylie's breath caught in her throat as she set eyes on her daughter, alive and well, with pink cheeks and tiny, perfect fingers. Her sobs returned, this time from an overwhelming mix of gratitude and guilt. Dr. Brooks stood at a respectful distance, allowing mother and child a moment of privacy. As Kylie held her baby, life seemed to realign in that tender embrace. She whispered apologies between tears, cradling the infant with trembling arms. Even though the road ahead was littered with obstacles, legal repercussions, the watchful eye of CPS, therapy, this moment felt like a chance at redemption. Yet one question lingered. What about the stray dog? After all, if Rusty hadn't found the baby, none of this would be happening. Kylie asked timidly if the dog was okay. Laura frowned. "We don't know," she admitted, explaining how the dog vanished amid the city's sprawl. Kylie's eyes flickered with concern, adding yet another layer of regret. She resolved to help in any way she could, though she had no resources herself. As the city slept, the story neared its climax. A mother found, a baby saved, and the potential for a second chance. But one hero remained missing, lost among the shadows of skyscrapers and back alleys. The resolution felt incomplete without Rusty's fate. For some, the baby's safety was enough. For others, like Marisol, Officer Salazar, and now Kylie, there could be no true resolution until the stray dog was also brought into the fold of a loving home. In an alley near the outskirts of the city, Rusty lay curled beneath a metal awning, battered by icy wind and the echo of passing trains. His body shivered, energy all but spent. In his half-lidded eyes, a faint memory surfaced. The small bundle of life he'd once protected from the cold. The memory gave him a spark of warmth, reminding him that even in a harsh world, acts of kindness could bridge impossible distances. Unaware of the drama unfolding in the hospital and precinct, Rusty simply held on, waiting for the first sign of dawn. Little did he know that dawn would bring not just daylight, but a turning point in his life, a moment that would tie together every thread of this extraordinary story in a way that would leave more than a few eyes brimming with tears. By the time the sun rose the following morning, Marisol was already awake, sipping a cup of coffee in her modest kitchen. The aroma of fresh brew mingled with her lingering worry about Rusty. Sleep had been elusive, haunted by dreams of the dog roaming snowy streets, hungry and alone. She glanced at the old clock on her wall, its ticking magnified in the silence. In less than an hour, she'd have to leave for the diner. But she felt a pull stronger than her routine, the urge to search for Rusty one more time. She knew she couldn't embark on a citywide hunt, but maybe, just maybe, she'd check that abandoned shipping yard again. At the same time, Donnell was on the move, too. The flyer he'd taken from his apartment lobby weighed on his mind. Something about the dog's unwavering compassion resonated with him. He didn't have much money, just a few crumpled bills from odd jobs, but he decided he'd spend the morning looking for this stray. If he found the dog, maybe he could get him to a shelter or call the number on the flyer. It seemed like a small way to prove to himself that he could do something good in a world that often felt stacked against him. Thus, two separate journeys converged by coincidence in the early morning light. Marisol arrived first at the shipping yard, which was eerily quiet except for the drip-drip of melting icicles. The lot was a graveyard of rusted containers and crumbling pallets. Snow drifts piled against chain-link fences. She called out softly, "Rusty? Rusty? Boy!" Her voice echoed. No answer. She pressed on, weaving between the containers, scanning for paw prints. After several minutes, she stumbled upon a cluster of footprints leading behind a long row of crates. Her heart leaped at the possibility. Meanwhile, Donnell had started his search in a different corner of the yard. He hopped a low fence, landing unsteadily on slippery pavement. "Hello," he called, though he wasn't sure how a dog might respond. His breath billowed in the cold air. Carefully, he checked each aisle formed by stacked containers, occasionally spotting fresh paw prints in the snow. "Hey there," he murmured, as if addressing the emptiness. Each step fueled his sense of purpose, a small spark of hope that he might do some good. By the time Marisol rounded the far corner, she spied a mound of fur nestled under a metal awning. Her stomach flipped. Was it Rusty or just another stray? She approached cautiously. The dog lay motionless except for a faint rise and fall of its chest. "Rusty," she breathed, relieved and alarmed all at once. His eyes flickered open at her voice, and he lifted his head weakly. Marisol knelt, tears gathering in her eyes as she saw the sorry state he was in, coat matted with ice, paws raw from the cold, ribs more pronounced than ever. She shrugged off her coat and draped it over him. "It's okay, boy. I'm here." A noise from behind startled her. Turning quickly, she saw a man she'd never met, Donnell, emerging from between two containers. He looked equally surprised, holding a dog treat in his hand. They locked eyes for a moment, neither sure what to say. Then Marisol realized he must also be searching for Rusty. "You know about this dog?" she asked softly, eyes red with emotion. Donnell nodded. "I saw a flyer," he replied, voice tight. "He saved a baby, right? I felt like I had to help him." Relief washed over Marisol, and she offered a shaky smile. "Yeah, that's him. I can't believe you came out here to look for him." She turned her attention back to Rusty, who whimpered when she tried to help him stand. His back legs trembled, struggling to support his weight. Donnell, moved by the sight, bent down to assist. Together, they gently lifted Rusty. The dog looked between them with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "We need to get him warm," said Donnell, glancing around. "There's a rescue center a few miles from here, but I'm not sure he can make it that far on foot." Marisol bit her lip. "I have a car, but it's parked a few blocks away." Rusty shivered under the coat, breathing shallowly. Time was of the essence. If they didn't act quickly, hypothermia could set in. "Help me carry him," she asked. Donnell nodded without hesitation. They gingerly lifted Rusty, each supporting half of his weight, careful not to jostle him too much. The trek out of the shipping yard was arduous, but adrenaline fueled their steps. As they cleared the fence, an odd sense of camaraderie emerged between these two strangers. Their breath formed matching clouds in the frigid air, and each slip on the ice was met with mutual concern. A passing truck driver slowed, eyes wide at the scene of a limp dog carried by a pair of determined Good Samaritans. But the truck rumbled on, offering no assistance. Finally reaching Marisol's car, they eased Rusty into the back seat, where she'd laid a blanket. She thanked Donnell, who hovered awkwardly, unsure if his part was done. "Come with us," Marisol urged, sensing he wanted to see this through. Donnell nodded again, climbing into the passenger seat. "I know the rescue center," he said, voice subdued but resolute. "Turn left at the main road." During the drive, Rusty lay still, occasionally letting out a feeble whine. Marisol stroked his head, whispering soothing words. Donnell stared out the window, his mind racing. He'd done something good, and it felt surreal. He realized he hadn't introduced himself properly. Turning slightly, he said, "I'm Donnell, by the way." Marisol offered a faint smile, meeting his gaze in the rearview mirror. "Marisol, thank you for helping. I've been looking everywhere for him." When they arrived at the rescue center, a flurry of activity greeted them. Staffers rushed to assess Rusty's condition, whisking him into a warm exam room. Marisol watched anxiously through a window as a volunteer veterinarian listened to his heartbeat, checked for frostbite, and started and forward drip for fluids. Donnell stood a few steps behind, feeling out of place yet compelled to stay. After what felt like ages, a vet tech emerged, expression hopeful. His weak, but stable. With warmth, fluids, and proper nutrition, he should recover. He might have some respiratory issues from the cold, so we'll keep an eye on him. Marisol let out a trembling breath, pressing her hand to her chest. Relief washed over her, and tears finally slipped down her cheeks. Donnell exhaled a quiet, "Thank God." They allowed themselves a moment of shared triumph. Rusty was safe, at least for now. As word spread through the rescue center that this was a dog from the news, the one who saved Baby Hope, a group of volunteers gathered. Some recognized Marisol from local interviews. Congratulations and gratitude poured in. The center's director, a middle-aged woman named Beatrice, clutched Marisol's hands. "He can stay here as long as needed," she reassured. "But if you or anyone you know would like to foster him, we'd be more than happy to arrange it." Marisol felt her heart pound. Could she really take Rusty home? She thought of her elderly mother, their small apartment, and her meager income. Still, the dog had carved a place in her heart. I need to think," she replied honestly, voice wavering. Over the next few days, Rusty received round-the-clock care. Marisol visited daily, bringing homemade broth and blankets. Donnell also stopped by, awkward but earnest, sometimes bringing small donations he'd collected from friends or a bag of dog treats. A bond formed between them, an unlikely friendship forged in compassion and gratitude. And Rusty, regaining strength, showed his appreciation with gentle licks and a wagging tail. Meanwhile, Baby Hope's future took shape. Kylie, under CPS supervision, began taking parenting classes and attending counseling sessions. She visited Hope at the hospital whenever allowed, forming a tenuous bond under the watchful gaze of Dr. Brooks and Laura Caldwell. The process wasn't easy. Kylie's guilt and inexperience weighed heavily on her, and there were no guarantees. But she showed genuine commitment, a determination that spoke louder than her past mistakes. The door to reuniting mother and child remained open, though it might take months or longer before it was deemed safe and appropriate. At last, the day came when Baby Hope was discharged from the hospital into a temporary foster home that specialized in caring for infants in crisis. The moment was bittersweet for the hospital staff, who had grown deeply attached. Dr. Brooks reminded them that the ultimate goal was for the baby to thrive in a permanent, loving environment, whether that was with her biological mother or an adoptive family. And so, in a quiet culmination, the city's hearts had been touched. A baby saved, a mother seeking redemption, and a stray dog who defied the odds to become a catalyst for change. Every participant in this unfolding drama, Marisol, Donnell, Dr. Brooks, Laura Caldwell, Officer Salazar, and even Kylie felt the threads of fate weaving them closer to an understanding of what true compassion meant. Of course, the future remained uncertain. Legal hurdles, financial struggles, and emotional scars don't vanish overnight. But the foundation of hope had been laid. A sense of closure emerged when Rusty, fully recovered, greeted Marisol with a cheerful bark at the rescue center. She smiled through tears, deciding then and there, if she could find a way, she would bring him home. Maybe she'd ask Danelle to help, or she'd talk to her mother about having a gentle companion around the house. One step at a time, but each step guided by the empathy forged in these cold Chicago streets. In that final moment of emotional closure, the city itself seemed to exhale, as if acknowledging that even amidst its hustle, heartbreak, and relentless winter winds, there was room for small miracles. A dog had heard the cry of a baby, and in answering it, changed countless lives. Now, that same dog found a warm place to heal, both physically and in the hearts of those who chose to care.